Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal interesting details on Tuesday, June 24, 2025. First, Curtis found himself trapped between the wreckage of a marriage he could no longer salvage and the heartbreak of a daughter he could no longer protect from the truth. When he informed Nina that his marriage with Portia was truly over, it wasn't just a quiet admission of defeat, it was a decision that sent tremors through the delicate emotional balance holding his family together. The one person he dreaded hurting the most was Trina. Her unwavering belief that her parents could overcome any hardship had been a lifeline during the chaos, and now, Curtis had shattered that illusion. He could see the shift in her eyes, the silent questions she wouldn't ask, and the pain she tried to conceal. As a father, Curtis had always promised himself he would never be the source of her suffering, and now that promise lay broken at his feet. Amid the personal fallout, Drew's growing animosity became a new and dangerous complication. Curtis was fully aware that Drew harbored resentment not only toward him but also toward Portia, and it wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. Drew was seeking retaliation, digging deep into Curtis's past, pushing buttons in the media, and hinting at legal pressure that could dismantle everything Curtis and Portia had built. Portia, unwilling to stand by idly, had started to prepare for battle. She began tracing Drew's questionable financial decisions, collecting anything that could be used as leverage in case things escalated. But Portia's protectiveness over Trina grew more intense with each passing day. She wasn't just defending herself or Curtis anymore, she was fighting to preserve a semblance of peace for her daughter. Yet the more she immersed herself in Drew's warpath, the more she realized that revenge, even if justified, came at a cost neither she nor Trina could afford. In the middle of this brewing storm stood Trina, the very person they were both trying to shield yet simultaneously breaking apart. Her trust in Curtis, once rock solid, began to erode as she watched the man she looked up to confess that he could no longer hold his marriage together. She saw her mother unraveling under the weight of a new vendetta, and she began to feel like collateral damage in a war she never asked to be part of. Trina didn't want apologies, and she didn't want reassurances that things would be okay. What she craved, though she couldn't articulate it, was evidence that her father still stood for something, that he would fight not for pride, but for her. Curtis sensed it. He knew the only way to begin earning back Trina's faith was through action, not words. And so, even as Drew closed in, and Portia braced for impact, Curtis steeled himself with a single purpose. To remind his daughter that no matter how chaotic the world became, she was not alone. He would be the anchor she could still hold on to, even if everything else was slipping away. Second, Drew could feel the weight of betrayal settle in his chest the moment Kia delivered the devastating news. Tracy, the woman he had once underestimated, was secretly orchestrating a plot to destroy his wedding to Willow. The revelation struck him like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a minor obstacle or a petty grudge, this was a calculated, personal vendetta, born from Tracy's desire to exact revenge for the humiliation she endured when Drew publicly cast suspicion on her motives and integrity. Now, it was clear, Tracy wasn't content to let it slide. She intended to humiliate him in return, using the wedding as the battlefield and Willow's trust as the first casualty. For Drew, that was unacceptable. This wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about survival. About control. About ensuring that no one, not even Tracy Quartermaine, could interfere with the future he had so carefully constructed. Almost instantly, Drew's mind shifted into strategy mode. He knew he couldn't let Willow discover any part of the truth, not the danger Tracy posed, not the fact that the ceremony was being targeted, and certainly not the secrets he was beginning to hide from her. To protect his standing with Willow, Drew began spinning a web of calculated deception. He softened his demeanor, doubled down on affection, and reinforced the illusion of unity and love. Behind the scenes, however, he was ruthless. He deployed private investigators to trace Tracy's communications, looking for vulnerabilities. He leaned on old business contacts to block her financial access and isolate her from key Quartermaine allies. He even considered planting a scandal that would discredit her entirely, something that would render any accusation or exposure from Tracy meaningless in the public eye. Drew didn't just want to win. He wanted to eliminate the threat Tracy represented so thoroughly that she wouldn't dare come near him or Willow again. Yet in this pursuit of control, Drew crossed a line he swore he never would. By choosing to deceive Willow, he risked corrupting the very foundation of the relationship he claimed to be protecting. With each manipulated moment and each half-truth told with a smile, Drew stepped further away from transparency and into dangerous territory, where love became possession, and protection became manipulation. As the wedding day loomed closer, Drew convinced himself he was doing the right thing, that shielding Willow from the chaos would preserve her happiness. But deep down, a darker voice whispered otherwise. Tracy might have started this war, but it was Drew who escalated it into something far more dangerous. And if he wasn't careful, the cost of silencing his enemy might be losing the woman he was so desperate to keep. Third, Drew could feel the weight of betrayal settle in his chest the moment Kia delivered the devastating news. Tracy, the woman he had once underestimated, was secretly orchestrating a plot to destroy his wedding to Willow. The revelation struck him like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a minor obstacle or a petty grudge, this was a calculated, personal vendetta, born from Tracy's desire to exact revenge for the humiliation she endured when Drew publicly cast suspicion on her motives and integrity. Now, it was clear, Tracy wasn't content to let it slide. She intended to humiliate him in return, using the wedding as the battlefield and Willow's trust as the first casualty. For Drew, that was unacceptable. This wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about survival. About control. About ensuring that no one, not even Tracy Quartermaine, could interfere with the future he had so carefully constructed. Almost instantly, Drew's mind shifted into strategy mode. He knew he couldn't let Willow discover any part of the truth, not the danger Tracy posed, not the fact that the ceremony was being targeted, and certainly not the secrets he was beginning to hide from her. To protect his standing with Willow, Drew began spinning a web of calculated deception. He softened his demeanor, doubled down on affection, and reinforced the illusion of unity and love. Behind the scenes, however, he was ruthless. He deployed private investigators to trace Tracy's communications, looking for vulnerabilities. He leaned on old business contacts to block her financial access and isolate her from key Quartermaine allies. He even considered planting a scandal that would discredit her entirely, something that would render any accusation or exposure from Tracy meaningless in the public eye. Drew didn't just want to win. He wanted to eliminate the threat Tracy represented so thoroughly that she wouldn't dare come near him or Willow again. Yet in this pursuit of control, Drew crossed a line he swore he never would. By choosing to deceive Willow, he risked corrupting the very foundation of the relationship he claimed to be protecting. With each manipulated moment and each half-truth told with a smile, Drew stepped further away from transparency and into dangerous territory, where love became possession, and protection became manipulation. As the wedding day loomed closer, Drew convinced himself he was doing the right thing, that shielding Willow from the chaos would preserve her happiness. But deep down, a darker voice whispered otherwise. Tracy might have started this war, but it was Drew who escalated it into something far more dangerous. And if he wasn't careful, the cost of silencing his enemy might be losing the woman he was so desperate to keep. Fourth, Nina had never felt such a potent mix of rage and desperation until the moment she overheard that Willow and Drew had set a date for their wedding. The very idea of Willow, a woman she had fought to protect and love in her own complicated way, binding herself to Drew of all people, was incomprehensible. It wasn't just that Nina knew the truth about Drew's manipulation and deceit, it was that she had once been part of it. She had once believed in Drew's carefully constructed image, had fallen into his charm, had even convinced herself that maybe he wasn't as dangerous as others claimed. But now, with Willow standing at the edge of a lifelong commitment, blinded by false promises and charm, Nina felt a responsibility that weighed heavier than any guilt she had carried before. Yet her hands were tied. If she exposed the truth too carelessly, her own past entanglement with Drew would come to light, something Willow might never forgive. Torn between protecting herself and saving Willow, Nina knew she couldn't fight this battle alone. She needed someone who had both the fire and the history to stand against Drew without hesitation. And so, swallowing her pride and setting aside years of animosity, Nina did the unthinkable. She sought out Carly. It wasn't easy. Carly was the last person Nina ever wanted to owe anything to, but in this moment, personal grudges were a luxury she couldn't afford. She approached Carly not with arrogance or manipulation, but with something far more rare, vulnerability. She admitted she had knowledge that could upend the wedding, that Drew was not who Willow believed he was, and that if they didn't act quickly, it would be too late. Carly, initially skeptical, listened closely as Nina laid out fragments of truth and fear, painting a picture of a man willing to deceive and dominate under the guise of love. Nina didn't beg often, but in that moment, she begged Carly to help her stop this wedding, no matter what it took. For Carly, the request struck at the heart of everything she once stood against. She had her own history with Drew, had watched his transformation from ally to adversary, and knew that Nina wasn't fabricating her fears. Carly also cared for Willow in her own way and had long since accepted that protecting Willow sometimes meant making unpopular decisions. But what Nina was proposing wasn't just confrontation, it was sabotage. And yet, there was something in Nina's voice, something unmistakably maternal and desperate, that pushed Carly into action. Together, the two women, once rivals, now reluctant co-conspirators, began to weave a strategy designed not just to delay the wedding, but to destroy its very foundation. They knew the risks. They knew the backlash would be swift and merciless. But for Nina, this wasn't about redemption or revenge. It was about saving her daughter from a life built on lies. And for Carly, it was about proving, perhaps to herself more than anyone, that no matter how far someone falls, there's always a way to rise and do the right thing. Even if it means standing beside the last person you ever thought you'd trust. Fifth, Carly stood in the quiet stillness of her home, watching her son with growing unease as he paced the room, eyes blazing with a fury that had been building for weeks. Michael was no longer the composed and rational man she had raised. He had become consumed by a single, burning objective, to make Drew pay for his deception, for manipulating Willow, and for threatening the fragile balance of the family they had all worked so hard to rebuild. Carly had seen this fire before, had watched it devour people who let vengeance become their only compass, and she feared that her son was now at risk of slipping down the same path. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was personal. Too personal. And Carly knew that if she didn't intervene, Michael might soon become someone he wouldn't recognize when the storm finally passed. She waited until the rage in his voice had softened, until his shoulders sagged just enough to remind her that he was still the boy who used to climb into her arms after nightmares. Then she spoke, not as a strategist, not as someone with a vendetta of her own, but as a mother. Carly gently reminded Michael that Drew wasn't worth the cost of his soul. That no revenge, no matter how justified, could ever restore peace if it came at the expense of his identity. She urged him to think beyond the betrayal and focus on what truly mattered, his children. Daisy's tiny fingers, Wiley's laughter, Amelia's unguarded smiles, these were the things that deserved his energy, his devotion, his love. Carly painted for him a vision of a life not ruled by conflict, but by healing. A life where Michael could be the father his children needed, not a man lost in retribution. She begged him to understand that happiness, not vengeance, was the legacy he should build. Michael didn't answer immediately. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but Carly could see the hesitation in his eyes, the quiet war between justice and peace playing out in his heart. She didn't need him to forgive Drew. She didn't even expect him to forget. But she needed him to choose his future over Drew's downfall. And as she placed her hand on his shoulder, Carly whispered the truth that had anchored her through her own darkest days: letting go wasn't weakness, it was strength. The kind of strength that allowed love to grow where pain once ruled. For the first time in days, Michael sat down, eyes lowered, torn but listening. Carly knew the battle wasn't over, but she had planted the seed of hope. Now, all she could do was pray that her son would choose love over war, and remember that the brightest revenge sometimes comes not through destruction, but through joy, peace, and the kind of happiness no enemy can touch. In the heart of Port Charles, where loyalty is tested as often as love, a delicate balance was shifting beneath the surface, one built on fractured truths, fragile alliances, and the painful weight of unspoken decisions. Curtis, torn between duty and devastation, stood at a crossroads, watching his daughter Trina drift into emotional isolation as his marriage to Portia crumbled. Drew, driven by bruised pride and the sting of betrayal, quietly laid the foundation for a ruthless takedown of those he believed wronged him. Meanwhile, Nina, paralyzed by guilt and desperation, broke every boundary of her pride to seek out the one person she swore never to trust, Carly. And against all odds, Carly listened. Not for Nina's sake, but for Willow's. Because in a world where revenge was currency, Carly had come to understand that the cost was too high for anyone to pay, especially the ones they claimed to love. As Carly and Nina formed a fragile pact, fueled not by friendship but by shared urgency, the battle lines became blurred. They were no longer fighting for themselves, but for the women and children who stood to lose everything if Drew's deceptions went unchallenged. Yet in choosing this path, they both walked a tightrope between righteousness and manipulation, between intervention and interference. Carly knew the risk of getting involved, especially when it meant challenging her own son's perception of the truth. But watching Michael's descent into vengeance reminded her of the very thing she had once feared becoming herself, someone who let anger dictate destiny. She couldn't allow Michael to burn bridges that could never be rebuilt, not when his children still needed a father who could choose love over hatred. For Michael, the choice was anything but simple. Drew had once been a trusted figure, almost a brother. But betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those closest. Every lie Drew told, every smile he weaponized against Willow, became another scar on Michael's heart. And yet, even as the fire in him grew, something in Carly's voice had pierced through. Her plea wasn't just for calm, it was for clarity. For the preservation of the parts of himself he hadn't yet lost. Standing in the eye of the storm, Michael realized that his children were watching. Daisy, Wiley, and Amelia didn't need a warrior. They needed a father. A protector. A man capable of walking away from destruction and choosing peace for the sake of something greater than revenge. That truth, more than anything, made him hesitate. And then there was Willow, at the center of every plan, every whisper, every motive. She remained blissfully unaware of the war unfolding around her, still holding hope that her future with Drew would be a new beginning rather than another trap. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and the people around her were beginning to make decisions that would either shield her from heartbreak or expose her to a truth far more painful than lies. Willow, who had already endured so much loss, would soon be forced to choose between the dreams she thought she wanted and the reality others were desperate to reveal. And when that moment came, it would not be Drew or Nina or Carly who shaped her destiny, but Willow herself, standing at the altar of truth with the weight of every deception pressing on her heart. Meanwhile, Drew continued to orchestrate his schemes with cold precision, unaware that his past sins had begun to unravel from within. The very people he thought he could manipulate were gathering strength, forging unlikely alliances in the name of protection, justice, and love. His confidence, once unshakable, would soon be tested by a wave of consequences he never anticipated. And when the final reckoning came, it would not be delivered by vengeance, but by the collective power of those he underestimated, mothers, fathers, and children who had everything to lose and no intention of surrendering without a fight. Drew believed he could control the narrative. But what he failed to see was that the story was no longer his to write. And so, as the sun set over Port Charles, its golden light casting long shadows over the lives it touched, the war beneath the surface marched toward its inevitable climax. Curtis stood ready to fight for Trina's trust. Carly remained firm in her belief that love could reclaim the broken. Nina, torn between shame and courage, chose to act when it mattered most. And Michael, though still haunted by betrayal, began to understand that strength wasn't always forged in fury, it was found in forgiveness, in family, in quiet resilience. The storm was coming. But perhaps, just perhaps, those who had weathered the most could finally learn that healing was not a sign of weakness, but the bravest act of all.